Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. This is a conversation about migrating your Looker Studio dashboards from Universal Analytics to GA4. This is a really timely conversation, given that July 1st is looming, and I think everyone knows that Universal Analytics is going to be sunsetting. So we are excited to talk to you about this today. I'm going to be joined by two of our resident experts, both Dan Vivaldi and Nina. And Nina will be doing most of the talking, but first we're going to go through kind of a couple of intro items. So let's take a look at our agenda. Thanks so much, Nina. So like I mentioned, we'll start with a couple of introductions, housekeeping items, and just getting to know who is InfoTrust. Then we'll move on to UA versus GA details. We're going to cover a couple of topics in this. And then we will kind of wrap up with questions and next steps, including a poll at the end to keep it a little bit interactive. I did want to mention that this is one in a series of talks that we've been given. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a lot of other content that InfoTrust has to offer. So please feel free to check our website for that. Do you mind moving ahead? Thanks so much. So a little bit about InfoTrust. We are a global company, a privacy-centric digital analytics solution company that is all about empowering marketers to make confident, data-driven decisions. We work with some of the biggest brands in the world, and we cover a lot of ground around digital architecture, platform integrations, and advanced analytics and data science. We have a lot of capabilities, but I think what makes us distinct is that we're actually segmented by industry. So we have a lot of industry knowledge around CPG, retailer and D2C, finance and auto, et cetera. And you will see that on our website. We actually have content in each of these areas. So with that, we actually wanted to get started on the topic at hand, and we're going to be launching a poll to get your feedback on how far along you are with the transition to GA4. What we hear from clients is that they feel like they're pretty far along, but it's really helpful to understand the specifics of how far along everyone is. So I'm going to give everyone a moment just to fill out the poll, and then we'll be commenting on the data as it comes in. People are still answering. Okay. So it looks like most people are still at the first step of migrating. GA4 implementation is in progress, with some also strong showing in the second and third categories. The fewest have fully transitioned, and I'm not surprised. This is what we hear from our clients every day. And that's why we're here to talk about how we can help you in this transition. So moving on, I think that we're going to turn it over to Nina and Dan, two of our solution experts in this area, to take us through some of the specifics today.
Awesome. Take it away, Nina.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Daniel, for that intro. And yeah, with that, let's kind of dive into the content here. First off, I want to start off with getting a better understanding and giving you context on the difference between Universal Analytics and GA4. And when it comes to discussing the differences, there are 4 types of differences that I want to highlight on this presentation. So the first thing is the metric differences, acquisition differences, event data differences, and then as well as segment functionality differences. And then as a note, I probably won't go into too much detail on the differences between metrics here, just because I do want to spend some time focusing on the dashboard migration process and the demonstration that we'll have later in the presentation. However, when it comes to the differences, there are a couple of things that I want to highlight here to give you a good context on how it might affect your reporting. So when it comes to users and sessions, according to Google's documentation, you can expect about 20% variance between the two platforms due to the differences in definitions and calculations. However, when it comes to page views and like event level metrics, those have more similar definitions, but at the same time, you should also expect about 10% variance due to the differences in how the two different platforms process and calculate those metrics. I also want to highlight here that when it comes to unique metrics, those are no longer available on GA4. However, you can potentially use a session or user metrics combined with event metrics to kind of visualize or report on the same kind of data. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is for conversions on UA, by default, it will automatically deduplicate the count to 1 per session. However, on GA4, it counts the conversion for every instance that it occurs. But recently, there's also a more recent update where you actually have the option to change the conversion count to 1 per session. This isn't the default setting, so you do need to go to GA4 and kind of edit that. So just kind of be mindful of those differences that might occur. And then on GA4, as you might notice, Google has introduced a couple of new metrics that are more related to engagement. So engaged session is the big one. So this essentially counts a session with at least 2 page views, lasts more than 10 seconds, and had at least 1 conversion event. This engaged session metric is then used to calculate bounce rate, which is essentially just the ratio of non-engaged user divided by total sessions. And then the same metric is also being used to calculate the engagement rate, which is essentially just a ratio of engaged session divided by total session. And then the next difference is related to acquisition data that is being reported. So on GA4, there's essentially 3 types of acquisition or channel grouping data. The first one is the first default channel group. So this is a user-based metric. It focuses more on first traffic source that led a visitor to the website. So this is the most ideal dimension to use when it comes to reporting how the user was first acquired. And then the second type of dimension is the session default channel group. So this is the session-based version. It focuses more on the most recent traffic source that led the visitor to the website. Most ideal for session-based analysis and understanding most recent user activity. And this dimension is also what is closest to Universal Analytics default channel grouping, which might be a little bit confusing because on GA4, there's also a default channel group. But on GA4, the default channel group is actually an event-based channel grouping. So this one focuses more on conversion events that happen during a session. So for example, if you're interested in understanding where purchases are coming from, you should use this event-based dimension instead. I also want to note that I do get a lot of these questions around custom channel grouping, which unfortunately isn't available to be pulled to Looker Studio via the GA4 connector at this moment. However, you can potentially create a custom formula on Looker Studio using like a case when statement to bucket like the channels by source medium manually. The only downside to doing this or using this approach is that it requires additional maintenance to ensure that the latest definition is being applied across the different Looker Studio dashboard. And then the next difference is around how events are being reported. So as you may know, Universal Analytics, there are 3 levels of data hierarchy. So each user will have a session or multiple session, and each session have different events. And then within each event, there's an event category, action, and label. However, in GA4, essentially every activity is considered as an event. So each user on GA4 will have multiple event, and things like session, page views, those are considered as event. And then each event will have many or multiple parameters associated with those events. And then lastly, there's a difference between segments in GA4 and UA. Previously, in Universal Analytics, when you use that as a data source on Looker Studio, you might see at the bottom here, there's an option to apply a Google Analytics segment. However, if you use a GA4 data as the data source for your reporting, you will no longer see this option because currently it's not an option or it's not available for a GA4 data source. The closest substitute that you can potentially use is either creating an audience The limitation of this is it's only available on a go-forward basis, and you can only segment data at the user level, and any kind of session level segmentation isn't really possible at this time. And the other thing with audience is that it is limited to the membership duration that you set on the property level. And then the second option, if you don't want to use audience, is to just essentially create or use a segment on GA4 Explore report, which definitely is not ideal, as this can't really be applied to any of the Looker Studio dashboard. But unfortunately, these are kind of the only option when it comes to segmenting your data. But we also want to note that GA4 is still an evolving product, so we're hoping that this will eventually be available, but these are kind of like the two options that you should consider with the current functionality that is available. Right. So now that we have a good context around the differences between UA and GA4, let's dive into the actual process of migrating your dashboards from UA to GA4. So the process itself is broken down into 4 steps, which are implementation, mapping, development, and sharing. We'll go into more detail on what kind of falls under each step on the next slides. So first, when it comes to implementation, and before you start building any dashboard on Looker Studio, you should just make sure that any necessary implementation on GA4 is completed and that you actually have good data to work with. And at InfoTrust, we actually built a UA versus GA4 comparison dashboard, which is essentially purposed to first help the implementation team to realize how close they are in terms of finishing the GA4 implementation. And then second of all, to educate the stakeholders and make sure that they're aligned in terms of their expectations on the differences between the 2 different platforms. We found that this step is pretty crucial because instead of leaving the stakeholders trying to calculate the difference between the 2 platforms in their head, each time they see a GA4 report, they can just kind of refer to this dashboard and get a refresher or understanding on the expected discrepancy. And of course, it's most importantly, we want to make sure that the trust in the reporting accuracy is being maintained, and also limit the amount of question or complaints regarding the data discrepancy or data quality due to different expectation about how each platform are kind of reporting these metrics. All right. And the second step is to map requirements to the implementation guide. In this step, you probably also want to prioritize which report you want to migrate first, as well as identify any potential metrics or dimension that needs to be substituted based on the data that is available on GA4. And to illustrate this process, I actually have 2 kind of documentation example here to kind of give you an idea of what this process looks like. So going into the implementation guide, essentially, you might have something similar to this, but this just kind of give you an understanding of what events are available on GA4, what the implementation status is, how it's being defined, as well as how it's mapped with Universal Analytics. And then using this document, it can guide you in terms of mapping your reporting requirement. So reporting requirement, pretty explanatory. So this is essentially just a document that captures the business question that you're trying to answer with your different Looker Studio dashboard, what type of metrics and dimensions are being reported, and how it's defined. And using these 2 documents, essentially, you should kind of map the metrics that are available on the dashboard and see what is the GA4 equivalent for that. Similarly, for the dimension, there is also some kind of mapping that you need to do between UA versus GA4. And you would just kind of go back and forth between the 2 different documents to make sure that you're aligned, whether the dimension or metric are available, and if it's not, what's kind of the alternative or substitute that you can use there. And then once you are aligned with how things are mapped, you can now proceed with the actual dashboard development. So when it comes to developing the GA4 version of an existing dashboard, there are 2 different options or ways that you can approach it. So option 1 is you can create a separate dashboard for GA4. The downside of this is that it requires you to reshare the dashboard link with the same set of stakeholders. And then the other option, which is what we would recommend, is to have everything in the same dashboard, but just have it as a separate tab. So this makes sure that everything's kind of organized in one place without the need of kind of resharing the link with separate stakeholders. And let's actually go through a demo to illustrate how these two different approaches work on Looker Studio itself. So what I have here is just a dummy Looker Studio dashboard that uses Universal Analytics as the data source. And on this dashboard, I also have GA4 as another data source that we can use to swap these data during our migration. So wanting to illustrate the first option here, which is to create a different dashboard link for GA4. So in order to do that, you can just go to File, make a copy, and then just select the GA4 data source as the new data source, and then click Copy Report. And then as you can see here, there's a lot of errors, so there's probably a mistake that I made. And that mistake is because when I added the data source, I did not enable the make reusable setting. So this, by enabling the setting, essentially, it lets you kind of reuse the same data source into a different dashboard link. So if you do want to use this option, you need to make sure you click on make reusable so that when you copy it into a new dashboard, it didn't give like an error of data is not accessible. So let's kind of try that again. Make a copy, use the GA4 property. And then now, as you can see, there's at least some data here. And then when we go to manage edit data source, we see that the GA4 data source is actually available and usable. And then as you can see, there are still some errors here in terms of chart configuration incomplete. So by default, it does try to, Looker Studio does try to map UA to GA4 if you do this approach, but it's not always accurate in terms of how it's mapping the metric. And when it comes to the scorecard visualization, there's currently a bug where if you swap out the data source, it automatically says chart configuration incomplete. But if you change it to a different chart and then change it back to a KPI score, for some reason it works. It's a known bug. We're still not sure yet why it occurs, but that's just kind of a quick hack to fix that issue. And I'm actually not going to proceed with kind of migrating with this option, and I'll kind of illustrate how to do the second option, which is just creating a new tab for the report. So let's see here. So what we want to do is essentially just go to the same dashboard, click on the page management, and just basically duplicate the page into a different page within the same dashboard. And then from here, you essentially just go into each visualization and swap it out with a GA4 equivalent of those metrics. So again, the first one was users. We probably want to map it out to the equivalent, and that is where the mapping document will come in handy. So users, the equivalent for GA4 is total user. So having this is very useful in terms of just being able to quickly identify what you should map it to and what you should swap the metrics with. And for the sake of time, I probably won't kind of go into each of this visualization to swap it to GA4. But there are a couple of metrics that I do want to kind of highlight and demo here because they might not be as straightforward. So one other example is unique page views. As you know, unique page view is no longer available on GA4. So on the mapping document, we have here that session is kind of the closest thing to unique page views. So you just want to make sure that this is being swapped with the appropriate metric. So sessions. And then the other thing is also related to the channel grouping. So Currently, it's reporting default channel grouping and how much traffic is driven by each of the channels. So let's try to copy this and see how it looks if we just swap it with the GA4 data. So as you can see, it automatically swap it with like a default channel group dimension for this session metric. And what's odd is that the grand total of the metric is only 500 when actually we have like about 14K sessions. And the reason behind this discrepancy is because we're actually using the event-based default channel group when we actually want to use the session default channel group. Because we are reporting sessions, so we want to make sure that it's within the same scope. And once you swap that out, as you can see, the grand total is matching with what is on the session here. So yeah, so be mindful when it comes to the default channel group. For some reason, they will automatically use the event-based one when most likely you are using the session-based for your reporting. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is how to swap out event-based reporting. So on here, we have scroll activity reporting to see how many people scroll, how many people are scrolling and how much of the content they are scrolling through. So this is, again, when the mapping document come in handy. So you can see that for UA, it's based on event category and event label, where it contains scroll. And then for GA4, it's based on event name and percent scrolled as the dimensions. So you want to make sure when you are migrating that, you're kind of using the same dimensions for GA4. So here, and then there, sometimes it doesn't automatically switch the view. So when you edit the filter for some reason, that's when it switch, or if you refresh the report, it might also fix it. But yeah, that's kind of, it gets a little buggy sometimes, but I think refreshing or like changing filters sometimes helps when it comes to Looker Studio editing. And then event count is the equivalent here. And then scroll, percent scrolled. And then as you can see here, this is kind of the equivalent is like scroll and then percent scroll, whereas on UA, it's event category and event label. And then one thing that you want to add is potentially just that filter. So currently we only have scroll event filter that is based on UA event. So you probably just want to change that into the GA4 version and then apply it on the table. And then one thing that I want to highlight in terms of kind of using this approach where you now have two different views within one report, there's one formatting tip that might be useful in terms of kind of differentiating the data between UA and GA4, which is by using this sectioning feature on Looker Studio, where you can essentially create cascading tabs within Looker Studio itself. So yeah, so let's change this section to Universal Analytics and then change this section into GA4. And then make sure it's nested in the same or appropriately, and then change this to GA4. So now, in case you have a report with multiple views, you can now just kind of nest it within the same section, and then the end user can still kind of navigate it more easily between UA and GA4 within the same dashboard. All right, so now that you get a little bit of an idea of what the process looks like on the Looker Studio itself, let's kind of go back to the slide here and talk through a couple of tips and next steps in terms of the development. And one thing I want to highlight also in terms of development is to also make sure that you validate and troubleshoot any discrepancy once you complete all of that migration between the metrics and dimension, and just QA and make sure that everything's aligned there. And then the last step is sharing. So again, if you use the option 1, which is creating like a different link for the dashboard, you probably want to make sure that the dashboard is shared with the appropriate stakeholders. And lastly, again, I think on the first step, I mentioned education. And then on the last step, I think another round of education might be useful for the stakeholder in terms of kind of understanding the discrepancy between UA and GA4. Ideally, you should set up like a live session to kind of walk them through to make sure they're aligned. And we also have here actually an example of what a discrepancy analysis might look like. So just kind of give them a better understanding. For example, if there are some report that has more discrepancy than the other, that might be a good time to reach out to your implementation team to see if the discrepancy is actually due to implementation or if it's kind of expected due to the platform differences. But having kind of like something, a central document that you can refer to is really helpful to make sure that everyone's aligned with what the discrepancies are, how much it should be, and if there's any tagging thing that needs to be adjusted. All right. Now that we've gone over the migration process, I do want to talk through some limitation with the GA4 connector. So some of the main limitations are, first, there might be some fields that isn't really available on the Looker Studio connector itself. So for example, entrances and exits currently are not available if you use the GA4 connector on Looker Studio, but it is available on the Explore report. When in doubt, in terms of what metric is available, we do have this website that you can refer to in terms of what metrics are actually available on Looker Studio versus BigQuery versus on the Looker GA4 Explore report. And then there's also some limitations in terms of quota or token limits, just because the Looker Studio GA4 connector does use the GA4 API. And then there's, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, segment is currently not available on Looker Studio or GA4, Looker Studio GA4 connector. And then there are also some potential discrepancy that you might see on the report versus the UI due to certain data processing issues. And these are some of the data processing issues that you might encounter. So first, I've seen a lot of issues with combining dimension and metric with the different scoping. I think I kind of illustrated that earlier when you try to pull event or session metric with like an event-based dimension, it will kind of minimize the data and calculate it differently. And for some reason, the GA4 UI and Looker Studio kind of process those scoping issue differently. So I would recommend kind of going away and making sure that going away from those type of analysis and making sure that the analysis that you're doing stay within the same scope. And then the second issue is related to cardinality. So when you display a report, make an analysis on Looker Studio, you might occasionally see other row appear on the table. And this might occur if you have if you are reporting dimension with too many dimension or cardinality. And there might also be issue with sampling, which might occur if you are trying to report more data than what is actually within the GA4 quota limit. And then lastly, there's also might be some issue with some thresholding, and thresholding is essentially Google's way of preventing identification of individual user. So this might occur on reports or analysis where you have too small of a sample size where it's easy to identify or tie the behavior to a specific user. So in those instances, GA4 or Google will actually kind of bifurcate the data and show it as other so that you can't really identify the person. So with all that being said, we do have a recommended approach for an ideal or best case scenario when it comes to migrating your Looker Studio report to GA4 and avoiding some of the limitations that I just kind of mentioned there. And that approach is essentially to use it in combination with BigQuery. And with BigQuery, you can essentially avoid any kind of data thresholding or sampling issue that I mentioned earlier. And you can also create some session-based segments using SQL queries. The other good thing with BigQuery is it also optimizes your Looker Studio performance because it enables you to transform data and do the calculation on the back end instead of having Looker Studio kind of do all of that transformation on the front end instead. And then lastly, it's not restricted to the API or token limits because it's kind of using its own processing instead of like the GA4 API. There are some limitation with BigQuery at the moment where the most obvious one is it requires technical resource to develop the table because it requires someone to at least be proficient or have a better understanding on how to write SQL queries. And currently, the default channel grouping dimension is not available via BigQuery. So any type of channel reporting is not available at this moment. And if you do decide to proceed with BigQuery as your data warehouse or transformation process, the overall migration process is kind of similar with a couple of additional things. So when it comes to implementation, you just need to make sure you are linking GA4 with BigQuery to enable the data to flow and the GA4 data flow into BigQuery tables itself. And then when it comes to the mapping, you also want to make sure that you're using the same mapping document when you are developing the tables. And then lastly, when you're developing the dashboard, essentially you want to connect it with a BigQuery table or BigQuery view instead of using the Looker Studio connector. So yeah, so I know that was a lot of things to cover, and we do have a Q&A at the end. And before we get into that, I will actually pass it back to Danielle to do a quick wrap up before we enter the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nina. I recognize that we have covered a lot today, so wanted to kind of recap, and then we will be using our subject matter experts to address some of the specifics that we've heard. So if you go into this next piece, and keep in mind, you will be able to have this recording as a resource that hopefully you can go back to and play the pieces what you need to be seen. So we covered a lot, the basics around UA to GA4, how to migrate Looker Studio reports, some of the limitations, and then ended around our recommendations, that there are quite a few. If you go to the next slide, we did want to kind of wrap up and put a bow on things and give you a couple of key takeaways. The first is be careful about those discrepancies between UA and GA4 data. You're probably going to have to educate your stakeholders. We recognize that that's not easy, but that will affect reporting of performance. Second recommendation, work closely with your implementation team. And make sure that you have that mapping document handy. A few of you did ask what type of resources you can have. We're happy to chat after this call about what we can and cannot provide, but building that kind of mapping is really helpful to help people understand how the measures stack up. And then final recommendation is around BigQuery. So using BigQuery for data transformation, just to make sure that you're taking your dashboards up a notch. Very, very important. So with that, just wanted to kind of broaden the conversation a bit, move to the next slide. We at InfoTrust are kind of all about turning this chaos into less chaos. I love this visualization because it really brings to light what our visualization team does. So with that in mind, you are not alone in this endeavor. If you flip to the next slide, we have quite a few resources. So as mentioned, you will be getting both this recording and the slides that you can go back to. But I would encourage you to check out our website because there are quite a few resources, webinars, one-pagers, etc., that you can use both internally to create adoption as well as for your own education. And so with that, I want to open it up for Q&A as well as launch our last poll. So our last poll is about if you need some help in this area. And for those of you who had really specific questions about your own challenges, I'd encourage you to say yes. We're happy to have that conversation with you and help you through this endeavor. So with that, wanted to open up for Q&A. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to address some of the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. And well done, Nina. You could tell that was all learnings that we've had over the past year with helping our clients transition from Universal Analytics to GA4. And we got some really good questions to hop into here. And The first one to address is in July, when Universal Analytics switches off, will the Looker Studio dashboards also stop working?
Yes. So currently, any of the Universal Analytics data, it will also, you no longer will have access to it by July. So we do recommend having that BigQuery available or activated so you can store the data, because otherwise, unfortunately, they will no longer be available.
Okay, thank you, Nina. And then we've seen challenges with conversion rate by channel group and Looker for GA4. Do you have any suggestions? Maybe using the session channel group?
Yes. So is the question around combining like a conversion event with a session dimension?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
less clear.
Yeah. Okay. So I think when it comes to reporting event-based or conversion-based metric with like a session dimension, the best way to approach this is essentially to do a data blending if you are using a Looker Studio, the GA4 Looker Studio connector. So on one table, essentially you just have the session information, and then on the other you use the event-based information, and then you kind of join it based on the session channel group and then the event channel group, and then you just kind of combine it together. So it is possible to be reported on Looker Studio, but it requires some kind of advanced configuration using data blending there.
Cool. And so then there's another question also related to data blends. And then if Google is going to enhance the reporting capabilities for data blends, it seems insane that the basic conversion rates are more difficult to calculate without consistent chart breaks. And one thing I'll add here is we do have some best practices around data blends. And so if you have questions around those, just talk to your team if you're working with us already. The other thing to note is that data blends can happen outside of the tool in BigQuery. So it is a best practice. Data blends are great and they're effective when they work. But if you want more control over the reporting and the quality of the reporting and the data, I would definitely suggest using BigQuery. But Nina, anything to add there?
Yeah, and also just want to highlight Looker Studio is a free visualization tool. Although it's great in terms of like visualizing data, when it comes to calculating or transforming on the Looker Studio itself, it will really slow down the report. So we recommend staying away from data blend if you can. But if you do have to do it, just be mindful that it will probably affect your reporting performance.
Good info. And then a question about quota limits and whether clients experience them very often. Is anyone using BigQuery to overcome this or any other options? What do you think, Nina?
Yes, so BigQuery does enable you to go to shy away from the quota limits just because it uses like a different method. So it's not subject to any of the GA4 quota limits. But if you are curious, if you are using the Looker Studio connector and you're curious on how to kind of measure how much you are using in terms of quotas, you can actually go to your dashboard, and I think I was using this as the Google Analytics or GA4, but you can kind of right click on each individual table on Looker Studio and see how much quota you're actually using on the report or on each individual visualization. And again, you don't have to worry about this if you use BigQuery, but if you don't have the resource to do that, this is one way to kind of make sure you are staying within the limit.
Super helpful. Thank you, Nina. And then I'll just add that, I think we're all used to Universal Analytics and using Looker Studio, and it's kind of the wild, wild west where everybody gets to create their own dashboards and use as much data from the API as you want. And those days are sunset.
Yeah.
So as we transitioned over to GA4, it's even more important to have an idea of how we're consuming data through the quotas through GA4, and you're orchestrating that. We've seen a lot of clients just create dashboards Everybody creates a dashboard. Everybody kind of creates their own dashboard at times. And this is where you have to be really diligent as an organization and manage how you're using that data to make sure you're staying within your limits.
Yep. And also just want to highlight that in terms of tokens, it is applied at the property level. So again, if you are a team of like multiple people spread out across different regions and using the same property, if your team member are using the same kind of API connector on their dashboard, you just need to be mindful that you guys are kind of consuming from the same kind of quota limits that is being imposed by Google. So.
Thank you, Nina. Another BigQuery question, should we use the streaming data from GA4 or use the daily export? And the question comes from what will give us the most live data. And I think this person kind of answered their own question. The streaming data comes in directly from GA4. We've worked with a number of clients using it. It's particularly useful, I'd say, around heavy promotion days if you're an e-commerce site or publications. A big time when you want to monitor and have access to real-time data. The streaming data is not perfect though. So there is a nightly process for the Google Analytics extracts where Google actually cleans up the data that's being reported and delivered to BigQuery. So I think the short answer is you can use the streams, just be a little bit cautious around the data quality, but you get the fully processed data the next day. And then a question about channel groups in BigQuery. And recreating them. So we've noted that the process data is not available in the extract. Nina, have you got any, you know of any ways that we could maybe create channel reporting within BigQuery?
Yeah, I mean, so source medium is available as a dimension on BigQuery itself. So you can potentially use those dimension and kind of try to recreate using like a pretty comprehensive SQL query. One thing that I do want to note is that when it comes to paid advertising effort, currently Google isn't really categorizing them properly either. So unfortunately, the channel grouping itself on BigQuery, we usually shy away from them if we can, and just use the API. But yeah, we'll see in the future. Maybe they might have it released soon, but currently it's just a big limitation on the BigQuery side. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We're at time. Really appreciate the questions and the interaction. Nina, great job. Appreciate all of your insight here and everything that you've shared, but I think we're good to wrap up for the day.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you both for your expertise. Have a good one.